Picture a sawmill in the Austrian village of Gmünd. The winter of 1948. Snow on the roof. No proper factory. No assembly line. Just a long wooden shed that used to cut timber, now smelling of motor oil and cold metal. Inside, a small team of men is bending sheets of aluminum by hand over wooden forms, shaping them into the body of a car that doesn't exist yet anywhere in the world. There's no money. The country is broken. The man whose name is on the door is sitting in a French prison cell, accused of war crimes, his health collapsing, and his son, quiet, stubborn, 40 years old, has decided that this is the moment to build a sports car, not to design one for somebody else, to build one under the family name. The first one rolls out of that shed and it's so light 2 men can push it. They call it the 356. Nobody in that freezing barn understands that they've just lit the fuse on one of the most powerful, most invisible industrial dynasties Europe has ever produced. Here's the strange part. You already know this family's work. You've seen it today, probably. You saw it on the road this morning. Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, Bentley, Lamborghini, Bugatti, Skoda, Seat. Half the badges you pass on any European motorway trace back, through a tangle of holding companies and cross-shareholdings, to one bloodline. A group that sells more than 8 million vehicles in a single year. A family fortune estimated north of $90 billion. And yet, ask the average person to name that family, and they can't. They know the cars. They cannot name the people. That gap, that enormous distance between how visible the brands are and how invisible the family stays. That's the whole story. That's what we're chasing here. And there's one rule underneath all of it. One non-obvious rule this family applied again and again, across a century, across a world war, across feuds that nearly tore them apart. We'll get to it slowly, because it only makes sense once you've watched it happen a few times. But here's the shape of it. Own the structure, not the spotlight. Let the brands be famous. Stay in the shadows yourself, holding the strings. Keep that in your mind as we go. Watch how often it comes back. Now go back further. Before the sawmill, before the prison, before any of it. Go to a small town in northern Bohemia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the 1870s, a boy named Ferdinand Porsche is growing up in a tinsmith's workshop. His father makes things out of metal, pots, roofing, repairs, honest, ordinary work. And the father wants the son to take over the shop. That's the plan. That's the whole future mapped out. But the boy is obsessed with something nobody in the village quite understands yet. Electricity. He reads everything he can find. He experiments at night. And here's the detail that tells you exactly who this person is going to become. As a teenager with no formal training, he wires the family home for electric light. Their house glows when the rest of the town is still burning oil lamps. He didn't just want to make one lamp work. He wanted the whole system, the generator, the wiring, the switches, all of it, connected, running. He was thinking in systems before he was old enough to vote. That instinct, to control the entire structure rather than just one piece of it, never left him. Hold on to that. It's the rule in its earliest, smallest form. He never finished a formal engineering degree. Never. He audited some classes in Vienna. He absorbed what he needed, and the rest he taught himself by doing. And this self-taught tinsmith's son would, decades later, be handed an honorary doctorate and effectively the keys to an industry. People would call him Dr. Porsche for the rest of his life. He earned a title he never sat an exam for. That tension between the formal world of credentials and the raw reality of what he could actually build runs through everything. In Vienna, he goes to work for a coach builder, and almost immediately he does something startling. At the very dawn of the automobile, when nobody's sure whether cars should run on steam, electricity, or gasoline, young Ferdinand builds an electric car, and not a crude one. He puts the electric motors directly inside the wheel hubs. No chains, no gears, no transmission losses. Then he goes one better and builds what we'd now call a hybrid, a gasoline engine generating electricity to drive those wheel motors. This is around 1900, more than a century before hybrids became fashionable. This man had already drawn the concept and made it move. He was always years ahead of the room he was standing in. And here's where you start to see the pattern that defines his whole career. He works for the big firms, Austro-Daimler, then Daimler in Germany, the company that would become Mercedes-Benz. He becomes their chief engineer. He designs legendary race-winning machines. He's brilliant, he's celebrated, and he's furious, constantly, because he answers to boards and shareholders who tell him no. Too expensive, too radical, slow down. And Ferdinand Porsche does not like being told no. So in 1931, in Stuttgart, he does the thing that changes the family's destiny forever. He's in his mid-50s, an age when most men are winding down, and he walks away from the safe, salaried prestige of running other people's engineering departments. He opens his own design bureau, his own firm, Porsche. He won't manufacture cars. He'll design them, engineer them, and license the work to whoever pays. He's no longer an employee. He's the owner of the ideas. And do you see what just happened? That's the rule again. Sharper this time. Don't be the famous hired genius inside someone else's company. Own the thing itself. Own the bureau. Own the patents. Own the structure. And let the giant corporations put their badges on the result. He stopped serving the industry. He started quietly positioning himself above it. From the outside, it looked like a small consulting shop with money troubles. Underneath, it was the seed of a dynasty. The bureau struggles at first. It's the depression. Money's tight. And then comes the commission that makes the name immortal and stains it at the same time. The new German government wants a car for the masses. A people's car, a Volkswagen, cheap enough that an ordinary family could afford one. And they want Porsche to design it. So in that Stuttgart drafting room, Ferdinand and his team sketch a small, rounded, air-cooled car with the engine in the back. Something that looks, people would say, like a Beetle. Now I have to stop here, because this is where the story turns dark, and I'm not going to skip over it or soften it. The regime funding the Beetle was the Nazi regime. The man across the table who wanted the people's car was Hitler. And when the war came, the factory built to make that cheerful little family car was turned to the military production. Ferdinand Porsche designed weapons, tank designs, military vehicles, and the wartime factories, like so much of German industry in those years, used forced labor, prisoners, conscripted workers, people with no choice and no freedom. That's part of this story. The same pencil that drew a cheap car for German families also drew machines of war. The origin of this dynasty has blood and coercion in it, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. I'm not here to deliver a verdict on the soul of a man who's been dead for 70 years, but I won't hand you a fairy tale either. The empire was seated in a very dark decade. Both things are true at once. When the war ends, the reckoning comes. Ferdinand Porsche is arrested by the French. They accuse him of war crimes connected to forced labor. He's held for around 20 months, much of it in a cold cell. An old man now, his health failing fast. The great engineer, the doctor without a degree, the man who was always 10 years ahead, sitting in prison while his life's work lies in ruins and his country lies in rubble. And this is the moment, the absolute low point, the family at its weakest, where everything could have ended. Watch what happens instead, because this is where the son steps forward, and the dynasty doesn't die. It's reborn. His son is Ferry Porsche, and before we follow him into that freezing sawmill, let me ask you something directly, because we're at the hinge of the whole story. If you're finding this as strange and compelling as I did when I first started pulling these threads, the hidden family, the invisible architecture under brands you see every single day, do that small thing that tells these stories to keep coming. Subscribe, hit the like button. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it means you won't lose the thread when we go deeper, because we're about to watch a tiny, broke family workshop set in motion, a chain of events that ends with it quietly controlling a giant 10 times its size. Stay with me. So, Ferry Porsche, with his father in prison and no real factory, makes the defining decision of his life. He doesn't go looking for a corporation to hire him. He builds a car under the family name, the 356, hammered out by hand in that Gmünd sawmill in '48. It's based on the Beetle's bones, the same rear engine, the same humble mechanical DNA, but lighter, faster, sharper, a proper sports car. And the badge on the front doesn't say Daimler. It doesn't say Volkswagen. It says Porsche. Think about how big that is. For half a century, the family had designed for others. Now, for the first time, the name on the door and the name on the hood were the same. The contractor became the mark. That's the rule turning a corner. They stopped just owning the ideas and started owning a brand of their own, with the family standing right behind it. And here's the piece of financial engineering that almost nobody outside the industry knows. The quiet move that funds the entire future. When that original Volkswagen Beetle goes into mass production after the war, and it sells in numbers that defy belief, eventually more than 20 million of them, one of the best-selling cars in human history, the Porsche family holds a contract, a royalty. For every single Beetle that Volkswagen builds and sells, a payment flows back to the Porsche family. Let that sink in. The people's car, the one designed in that Stuttgart room, becomes a river of money running quietly into family hands. Decade after decade, car after car after car. They didn't need to own the Volkswagen factory to profit from it. They owned a sliver of the structure, and that sliver paid out for generations. The rule again, always the structure. That royalty money plus the growing success of the Porsche sports cars builds the foundation. Through the 50s and 60s, the 356 gives way to a car that becomes a legend in its own right. The 911 with its unmistakable shape and its engine hung out behind the rear wheels. An engineering decision experts said was wrong and the family insisted was right. It's still in production today, more than 60 years later. The family stays in control. The brand goes global. Exactly the pattern. But now the dynasty faces a different kind of danger. Not war, not prison, but itself. Because Ferdinand Porsche had a daughter too, Louise, and she married into a family called Piech. And her son, Ferdinand Piech, grandson of the old founder, grows up to be every bit as brilliant, every bit as ruthless, and every bit as hungry as his grandfather. Now you have two branches of the same bloodline, the Porsches, the Piechs, cousins, and they cannot stand sharing the wheel. By the early 70s, the feuding gets so bad that the family makes a remarkable collective decision. Every family member must step out of operational management of the company. No more Porsches or Piechs running the day-to-day. They'll own it, they'll sit on the supervisory board, they'll collect the wealth, but they'll hire outsiders to actually run things. They pulled themselves back from the controls of the machine they built to stop the machine from tearing the family apart. Ownership without daily command. The structure preserved, the bloodline cooled down. It's a stunningly disciplined move, and it tells you everything about how this family thinks. The company is bigger than any one cousin's ego, and the family's long-term grip matters more than anyone's short-term crown. Ferdinand Piech, denied the throne at Porsche, does something audacious. He goes and conquers a different kingdom. He joins Volkswagen, the very company his grandfather's Beetle built, claws his way to the top, becomes its chief executive, and turns a struggling, bloated carmaker into a colossus. Under Piech, Volkswagen swallows brand after brand. Audi, refined into a luxury powerhouse, then Bentley, then Lamborghini, then Bugatti, reborn to build the fastest cars on earth, then Skoda, then Seat. He assembles piece by piece the largest car group in Europe, a grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, sitting atop an empire of badges, most of which the public never connects to the name Porsche or Piech at all. The mask on the hood, hiding the family behind it. And now the two halves of the bloodline are circling the same enormous prize. The Porsche side owns the sports car company. The Piech side runs the giant Volkswagen group. Same blood, two thrones, and someone, eventually, was going to try to put them back together. Two rivers long separated, drifting toward the place where they rejoin. Which brings us to the most jaw-dropping episode in the whole saga. 2008, the Porsche company, small, fabulously profitable, but tiny compared to Volkswagen, decides to do the unthinkable. It decides to swallow Volkswagen whole. The minnow will eat the whale. Quietly, using complex financial instruments, options, derivatives, Porsche's leadership accumulates control over a staggering share of Volkswagen stock, mostly in secret. The market has no idea how much they hold, and then they announce it. They're going for full control of a company many times their own size. What happens next is one of the wildest moments in the history of finance, because so many professional investors had bet against Volkswagen's shares, had shorted the stock, expecting it to fall. And when Porsche reveals it has cornered nearly all the available shares, those investors panic. They all have to buy the same tiny pool of remaining stock at once to cover their bets. The price explodes. For a few delirious hours, Volkswagen briefly becomes the most valuable company in the entire world. On paper, a car maker built on a Beetle is worth more than any business on the planet. The Porsche family's audacious raid had triggered a financial earthquake. And then, the twist inside the twist. It backfires. The global financial crisis hits. The debt Porsche took on to pull off the raid becomes a noose. The hunter gets caught in its own trap. Suddenly, the small company that tried to eat the giant is choking, drowning in the loans it raised for the takeover. And the giant turns around. Volkswagen, the whale, ends up acquiring the sports car company, Porsche, instead. The exact reverse of the plan. But here's the beautiful, dizzying truth underneath the chaos. When the dust settles and the two companies are bound together, who sits on top of the whole combined structure? A holding company called Porsche SE. And who controls that holding company? The Porsche and Piech families. The two rivers rejoined at last. It almost didn't matter, in the deepest sense, which company technically bought which, because both were the families, and the family ended up holding the master key to all of it. They controlled the holding company that controlled the group that controlled the brands, layer upon layer upon layer, and at the very top, the bloodline. Even a takeover that failed delivered them exactly what mattered, control of the structure. That's the rule in its final, fully grown form. Don't fight to be the famous name on the building. Fight to own the holding company that owns the company that owns the building. Let everyone else watch the brands. You keep the structure. Across 100 years, from a wired-up house in Bohemia to a sawmill in the snow to a boardroom raid that shook the world's markets. The same idea, again and again and again. Before we wrap this up, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, which of these brands did you have no idea traced back to this one family? Audi, Bentley, Lamborghini? I'm genuinely curious how hidden this really is. Tell me below. So let me try to be fair to the obvious objections, because you should be asking them. Wasn't this just luck? Wasn't Ferdinand Porsche simply standing in the right place at the exact moment the automobile exploded into the modern world? Partly, sure. Timing mattered. He was born into the dawn of the car, and that's a gift of history no one can engineer for themselves. And wasn't the rest just cold, ruthless financial maneuvering, cornering stock, exploiting royalties, hiring and discarding executives? Also partly, yes. There's nothing gentle about how this fortune was built or kept, but luck doesn't explain a century. Luck doesn't explain why the same instinct shows up in a teenager wiring a house, in a 55-year-old opening his own bureau, in a son building a car in a barn, in cousins engineering a cross-holding that survives a failed takeover. That's not luck repeating itself 8 times. That's a system of thinking passed down like an heirloom. The willingness to take the long view when everyone else is grabbing for the short one. The discipline to step back from the controls to save the family. The patience to own the boring structure while competitors chase the shiny brand. Call it cold if you like, but call it deliberate. And that's really the thing I want you to take with you. The lens you can carry out of here and use on the world. Most of us are taught to chase the product, the famous thing, the visible win, the name on the door. This family spent 100 years quietly teaching a different lesson. Own the structure underneath the product, and think not in quarters, but in generations. The badge on the hood is just a mask. The real power is in the holding company nobody puts on a poster. So you'll drive past these cars tomorrow. The Audi at the light, the Volkswagen in the next lane, the Porsche you hear before you see. And now you'll know, behind all of them, through layers of ownership most people never glimpse, stands one family. A family seated in a dark decade, refined in a freezing sawmill, nearly broken by its own feuding. And somehow, against all of it, still holding the wheel, more than $90 billion, held by people you still probably couldn't pick out of a crowd. And it leaves you with a question I can't quite answer. A dynasty this quiet has survived a world war, a prison cell, a civil war between cousins, and a takeover that blew up in its hands. And it's still here, still hidden, still in control. So where does a family like this go next? When you've already mastered the art of owning everything while being seen as nothing, what's left to want? I don't know. But I suspect they're already thinking about it. 3 generations ahead, right now.